approximately September 15th. We saw him here on September 17th. And with Dr. Signori's help, we went through a differential diagnosis of possibilities. We didn't have the results of the biopsy. And the remedy he was on was sulfur 200. And the 1 dry, 2 wet is our shorthand way of saying it, where he had doses from liquid and dry in the same day of the 200.
200C?
200C. Or CK, it was boron. So a week went by, and he forgot to call me about the results of the biopsy. So when we finally made contact, I didn't see the results of the biopsy in writing, but he reported in his own language that the doctor said that the biopsy showed that he was allergic to a drug, and that was the reason for the skin eruption. So what would that be in medical terms? Would you see that on the biopsy? So vasculitis perhaps, or an allergic urticaria. I'm not sure which one they would have said, but they didn't give him any medical language. And the doctor said it was mostly the statin that he was on. It was the cause, which we'd already taken him off of as a homeopathic patient. So the sulfur 200 was continued. At first, the first few days, 5 to 6 days, the redness got lighter and lighter each day, but the lines were still there, and they itched at night. We kept him on sulfur 200, and by September 30th, about 2 weeks, he said he was so much better, no lines, no itchiness. So we stopped the remedy. Okay, so that was it. And that's the resolution. No more follow-up.
Thanks for the follow-up. That's very helpful.
Okay, right.
Question.
Sure.
What would you see on a biopsy that would tell you it was a drug erection versus something else?
Oh, it's kind of non-specific. They might have like eosinophils, like tissue eosinophilia, but I mean it's not really specific, you know. The pathologist would know exactly what type of perivascular responses you would get. They might be able to say it favors a drug versus this versus that.
But it can't be definitive.
Very rare, yeah. So it might be suggestive, but it's not like, oh yeah, you're allergic to your statin. They might not even be able to say for sure it's a drug reaction. They might have said like suggestive of an allergic drug reaction.
So,
yeah.
Was he already off the statins when he was here?
Yes.
Off them?
Yes.
Do you think if he would have just stayed off them over time, it might have just dissipated?
I don't know how you would judge that, because I don't know how the side effects of that statin work. We'd have to have the experience of a lot of people with a lot of side effects of statin, so we could say before we could say that. But okay. I'm sure it helped. Right? We don't want to put any more of the causative agent into the body.
He was clearly reacting to the remedy. You take the remedy and the itch would go down, right?
That's right. It was like what, 30% after 2 days. So that seemed to be a positive effect of the remedy, not just being off of the statin.
Were there any other changes in him in general?
He didn't report any. You know, when we had originally seen him about 6 months ago, he had sleep problems, and that was better with the NAMIR. And then he didn't report any new physical problems when they did the follow-up on the phone.
Well, and also, we had him stop the medication, right, and try to remedy which hadn't worked.
APIS. We tried APIS first.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, maybe it takes some time.
Yeah. So Lisa had talked to him on the phone. We didn't even see him in person. And we had pictures from the emails. And that's why we chose APIS first, without a lot of detailed information. But we took him off the new medications, which had only been started for 1 month, right, the statin. So that was by appearance of the skin through the email, was to me the most likely culprit, because we already knew his general health. We didn't think of mushrooms or those other things that you brought up.
He got a great response. I mean, nice and quick. I mean, you know, you can't ask for better than that. Just from stopping the drug and the sulfur, he did great.
Okay. All right. So then, after after, you practice a while and you see a lot of cases and you see a lot of people trying a lot of different therapeutic approaches. And then, if you have an opportunity, questions come up in your mind about the bigger picture. So this is a talk that takes what Hahnemann said 200 years ago and tries to apply it to modern situations. That is, as we practice classical homeopathy more and more, we see that Hahnemann anticipated many things about sickness and disease and medicine that still are true, right? And that's why we call him a genius. And one of the things he talked about was using the word wholeness long before there was anybody else's language in medicine. And so we're going to talk about it in modern context if possible today. So the title is Wholeness in the Organon, and specifically we're going to apply it to functional medicine and what functional medicine says is wholeness versus what Hahnemann says is wholeness. Okay. So Hahnemann says disease is not a material thing, as conceived only by materialistic minds that has for millennia taken medicine in deplorable directions. Disease is not separate from the living whole, which is the organism and its enlivening dynamis. So then, here we have Hahnemann saying materialism, one of the cornerstone assumptions of mainstream conventional medicine, is inadequate to describe life forms, but more practically, it's an inadequate assumption because it leads to treatments that never cure. Right? It does different things, what's called palliation, or in other words, suppression. But according to Hahnemann's observations and reading the history of all the medical therapeutic modalities around the world and through history, there were not true cures. If you look at the wholeness of a person and all their aspects of life and health, and if you look at them long term, over long times, people's health. So then he introduces what every culture except the modern last 50 years has seen, that life is not the same as death. There is another power, force, energy, thing, if you want to say it materialistically, in the human form that's beyond what can be analyzed materially. Okay, and that has lots of different words depending who you read and when you read it. But the word, in this paragraph, he uses the word dynamis, a word he coined himself, and it's the same in German as in English. Okay, life force, vital force, these. None of these words work today in the modern mainstream science, but whichever phrase is appropriate to you in your practice, such as self-healing capacity. I even hear homeopaths use the word mechanism, which Hahnemann did not appreciate as being adequate to describe what it is. But there are a lot of phrases. You have to find the one that works for you. But we all, as naturopaths and homeopaths, believe that in the self-healing capacity of the life form. Not this. Right? This is the materialist view where you use a metaphor of what's going on inside the body as mechanical things, machine-like things. Right? In modern times, we have the computer as the most modern metaphor. Computer is short for computing machine, right? Computers, it's just another machine or mechanistic model. Or there is materialism. The organism is a material instrument of life, but not conceivable without the dynamis. The dynamis is not conceivable without the organism. They make a whole. The two are one. The body and the life force are unity, even if the mind's understanding splits the unity into two concepts. So we learn from, maybe not day one, but year 2 or 3, that we are analytic, cause and effect, linear thinking in the Western way of approaching education, right? So then the Western way is we've got a body, we've got a mind, we've got emotions, and if you're a naturopath, homeopath, you've got a life force. And so that's one thing, one thing, one thing, one thing. That is not the way it is. One cannot exist without the other. They are concurrent and inseparable. So for instance, in modern medicine, we have the duality of mind and body. Right? You have a body that works one way and the mind does something else, at least until recently. Now, of course, the modern concepts of mind are reduced to materialism as well, mostly in the mainstream. But the point here is that they're not a totality of 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 parts equaling a whole, but the totality is first and only. Okay. Picture of Curlian photography of leaves. Dr. Fury, you did some research on Curlian, did you?
Yeah,
You were
yeah, back in the day.
back in the day. So there's all sorts of explanations of what this energy field is. I don't know what was the current one when you did it.
Plasma, some type of plasma. Yeah.
So, you know, maybe electromagnetic in modern times, or bioelectromagnetic. That is still, they try to reduce it to a materialistic thing. So then, in modern thinking, there's at least some attempt to get away from reductionism, simple reductionism. That is, that we're nothing but the sum of our parts, even in life. And then they use the word holism. We're using the different spellings here to make a point. So what did they mean originally when they used the word holism? Well, first, let's talk about reductionism. It resolves elements from a complex life form or body. It resolves the body into constituent parts like organs, tissues, cells. Resolves a complex body into ultimate parts. The ultimate part, so the smallest part, the basic part, the basic unit builds the rest. Right? This is the idea of reductionism. So then we had the idea, or still do a lot of times, that the cell is the basic unit and the cells build themselves up into the body. Or more recently, the genes build the body. Right? This is the reductionist idea. Chemistry is all you need to know. Biochemistry is all you need to know. The physiological parts are all you need to know. It explains living bodies by analyzing the parts. Right? There's hopefully an illustration. Right? A bunch of cells, and somehow that equals the life. Or the gene theory as the basic unit. So gene up on the top there, gene theory. Get help? No, why not? It would not enhance my differential reproductive success. This is from Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene. I think you've read that. Right? The gene is the basic unit, and it does everything for its own survival, nothing more. So the reductionist assumptions. The ultimate parts, like the DNA, give rise to the formation of the rest of the parts. The living body is compared to a machine, like a computer. It can be taken apart into pieces and put back together again. That's the reductionist assumption. So therefore, you have to learn in school every pathway, every mechanistic chemistry that goes on in the body. You learn all the parts, all the anatomy, and so on. You know, of course, that's there. So it is knowledge to be learned, but how it's applied in medicine is the problem. So the reductionist approach says the sum of the parts equal the whole, and the holism, H-O-L-I-S-M, assumption is we can't reduce the parts and retain the meaning of the whole. Illustration, the body as a machine. Again, the more modern machine has to do with biochemistry and electricity. You know, neurons are the basic unit, And the electricity and chemistry of the neurons is all you need to know what the mind is. Here's the Humpty Dumpty nursery rhyme. There's even an X-ray of them back up there in the top. So what did the Humpty Dumpty rhyme say? It says that when he fell, broke into all the pieces, the king's horses and the king's men. What are they metaphorically? The king's men are the scientists and the physicians, and horses are the instruments, the imaging, the tools that the men use, and that the holistic assumption of that interpretation of that nursery rhyme is you can't put them back together. That's another example I use. Take a baby, right? Chop up the baby in lots of pieces to study it, and then can you put the baby back together into a living whole? You cannot. So the holism, trying to get away from the reductionism, is that living things are in actuality not separate parts, not separate processes, not independent components, and you can't put the back together again the parts to make a whole. And in fact, there are infinite characteristics in an organism, and it's artificial to separate them when none are in reality separate from the rest. So this is the most common idea of holism. Right? We break away from the idea that we're the sum of our parts, and instead we often say we're more than the sum of our parts. Well, what in the world does more mean? Right? And that's an unknown, right? So it introduces something magical or supernatural or mystical or unknown into the equation, and the mainstream doesn't want any part of that. They're only concerned on what's you can study with materialistic science. But those who know that the life forms are more than the sum of the parts then start saying that they're going to treat people, not just their parts. And so then you get all these methods to try to look at everything a person does do or can do. Fitness, diet, foods, activities, the health determinants. Right? So holistic medicine then is addressed by addressing all the determinants of health that you learn. Okay. So, disease. Suffering is a local part, depends on the rest of the body, and is regarded as an inseparable part of the whole. Right? I think when Dr. Signori started, he asked him to read this part of the Organon, because what does this say? It says dermatology is dangerous, not just dermatology, but the specialty approach in regular medicine is incomplete, inadequate. When you're only looking at parts, as specialists do, they never can cure the whole disease. I shouldn't say never, excuse me. They're more likely to overlook the wholeness of the disease process. Okay. Again, excuse me for using dermatology as an example, but there are the things that you see on the skin the disease. Hahnemann says there is no such thing, with some exceptions, having to do with injury and trauma and mechanical reasons for what happens to the skin, that the disease is not the skin. It's only part of the whole disease process. Okay. So we have parts, again, a machine analogy here. Parts of the bicycle are not the bicycle. So in regular medicine, then they are realizing that they have to kind of put all the parts together. Systems medicine, they call it, the application of engineering precepts to biological systems, based on a network of interacting components. This is the coordination of organ systems, the endocrine, digestive, respiratory, with gene expression, environmental, and behavior factors. And it's the interaction between all these components that is disease. That sounds good, sounds holistic. So then they draw pictures like this. Right? It's a hierarchy, right? From the cell, right? And then a larger level, the organs, the organ systems, and you sum up all those components, and you've got the disease. Disease as a network, not just a diagnosis. Okay. So you can see what's in more detail. You have the genome and the proteome and the metabolite, right? When they started with the idea they're going to describe everything about the genome, right? You know everything about the genome, then they were going to know enough to cure disease. It didn't happen. So then they decided, well, we have to know the proteome. We have to analyze every protein and how it functions and where it functions in the body, and then we'll be able to cure disease. Didn't happen. And so we keep going up the ladder here in complexity. But this is how systems medicine is trying to approach things. Network medicine in this slide. And as we'll switch over it, it's also how functional medicine is functioning, is treating people. It assumes a hierarchy based on the, the small unit or the basic unit or the ultimate unit as being responsible in building the rest of the bigger and more complex parts of the body, a hierarchy. So, to a homeopath, to a Hahnemannian homeopath, is this really holistic? It does include connectivity and integration at multiple levels. It expands medicine beyond reductionism, but it is still reductionism according to the organon. So let me put it in perspective here. The new medicine that is trying to do this is really needed. It really helps. Okay, and we have so many disease-causing exposures in modern culture. We need to address those things. We need to get rid of the toxins. We need to get rid of the environmental impacts that are bad for the health. You need to look at what allopathic treatments are doing, vaccinations, antibiotics, whatever. This, the systems medicine, the functional medicine is doing, and it's totally necessary. Okay? But there's another step to go through in medical thinking. So functional medicine treats root causes based on physiology of organ systems working together, the functions of organ systems. You don't treat the thing, you don't treat the liver, you treat the function of the liver in relation to the function of the kidney, in relation to the function of the bowels. So the functions, physiology, functions or physiology, biochemistry. For instance, instead of saying treating the cardiovascular system with a cardiovascular specialist, you treat the transport function of the body, which includes the cardiovascular and lymphatic systems. Or you could treat the assimilation system, the function of that system, which in older terms is the GI specialist and the lung specialist and the dermatologist and the reproductive specialist all together, right? So it is more holistic at the level of organ system functions. Remember our hierarchy, organ systems. So when you look at the guys who are talking the most about functional medicine, they usually have 7 major functions. Well, this is a page from Jeff Bland's website. You can see what those 7 core processes are. And this is his book, The Disease Delusion. The delusion is the disease is the problem, instead of the function of the organ systems. All right, functions of the physiological processes then is the root cause of disease for functional medicine doctors. The assimilation, the detoxification, the defense, the cellular transport, cellular communication, the energy and the structure. This is how they divide the body. They're still dividing the body. The workup includes the basics plus several more tests that regular doctors don't usually do. Wrote a few here as examples: saliva, allergies, digestive, urine tests. And here's a quote from a functional medicine doctor: just as a mechanic might hook your car up to a diagnostic computer to get more information. There's nothing wrong with more information. That's the way you prove that mercury is dangerous. That's the way you prove vaccinations have side effects in a lot of people. It's the way you need the information. Okay, so we don't want to put down functional medicine, but realize that it's still, to a homeopath, only a step towards real holism. Functional medicine treatment relies more on lifestyle interventions and supplements. It still assumes the disease as a material physiology, and it aims treatment at the organ system functions, right? So remember the cell there on the far side is the basic unit, and then in the hierarchy, it goes to tissue, it goes to organs, it goes to organ systems. Organ systems function of is where functional medicine is, not truly at the level of the whole organism. What do we mean by that? What does Hahnemann mean by that? Okay. How do you have a visual image of true wholeness? So this is one image that struck me, maybe not everybody. So then functional medicine, according to Hahnemann's way of thinking, is a type of holism, and we're going to make up our own language here. We'll call it extrinsic holism. The body is reducible into functional systems. The holism comes from without. It's analytic, it's mechanistic, like engineering systems, and it involves thinking in a hierarchy. There's more important and less important, or smaller and bigger parts of the body, and they have different levels of importance. You might say levels of causation. DNA causes the rest of the body, or the cells cause the rest of the body to form. So this is a hierarchical, mechanistic thinking of extrinsic holism, of which functional medicine is a part. Okay. So in contrast to that, we're going to introduce the language intrinsic and spell it, holism, a different way. So this is then meant to represent what Hahnemann says, intrinsic wholeness. Organisms live their lives as irreducible wholes, not reducible to processes of a lower order. The action of the whole is a certain unity and completeness, a concrete reality which is not wholly exhausted by analysis into parts, not completely explained in terms of the action of the parts either. Everything affects everything else. Intrinsic. Dictionary. Intrinsic refers to something inborn, inbuilt, inherent in your system, just like your thumb impressions, you cannot get rid of them. Okay. So intrinsic wholeness is inherent. Here's a holistic practitioner's phrase, quote: parts of a clock are put together in a certain way. The parts of an organism grow within an integral unity from the very start. They do not add themselves together to form a whole, but progressively differentiate themselves out of the prior wholeness, like a seed or germ. So what is an example here? Let's say you take a whole wheat berry, or a seed of wheat, right? And you grind it up into, biodynamic, organic whole wheat flour, and you give it to the chemist. They know exactly what it's composed of. They analyze the chemistry. Then you give them the whole wheat berry, the seed of the wheat plant, and give it to the chemist and ask them to analyze it, and they'll say it's exactly the same. But it isn't. Right? You can't grow another wheat plant from the flour. You can only grow another wheat plant from the seed, from the whole wheat berry. From the seed, from the embryo, comes the wholeness of new life. Is a baby formed by adding on pieces? The inherent wholeness is already there in the original. the original merging of the two cells. The wholeness is already there. Okay, so that's the different point of view. It's innate, self-organizing, generative, it makes its own parts. Here's the example of the whole wheat. Look at all the parts on the left, or my left, but over here. Look at all the parts you can analyze it into. But no matter how many parts you differentiate, it's not the same as the whole wheat plant. This inward oneness of intrinsic wholeness of development in time does not proceed towards a whole, but rather expresses it. The living whole makes its own parts. There's a coherent, meaningful living oneness, and not a hierarchy, but a holoarchy, or holarchy. The physical parts are both cause and effect of themselves. There's no privileged level of cause in this way of thinking. The DNA doesn't cause the organism. The cells don't cause the organ. You know, it's unknown enough why, you know, the original cells to make a baby can differentiate, and the same DNA can differentiate into how many different types of cells in the body? 200. The brain cell, the muscle cell, the bone cell, all have virtually the same DNA. How does the life form know to do that? Well, they come up with gradients and all sorts of explanations. But just as unknown is, how does the chemistry or whatever know to stop? Why does it stop making heart cells? Why does it stop making brain cells? Why doesn't the liver keep getting bigger and bigger? You know, there's so many things that are unknown because of the limitations of materialism and reductionism. Holarchy and complexity theory instead of the word vital force. So we have then the alternative language that those who are trying to break away from simple or naive reductionism are coming up with that just make it more complicated. Look at this, to try to get holism out of the pieces. Materials and systems and detectors and effectors and systems and feedbacks and adaptation and information and energy and matter. Look at all in the world to try to describe holism in old terminology. Materialist reductionist building up to try to get to holism. The organism is a continuing unity. The unity of the organism is not decomposable without loss. You can't study something less than the whole without losing understanding or meaning of disease and how to treat it. No part of a living unity and no single process of any complex organic activity can be fully understood in isolation from the structures and activities of the organism as a whole. Any process must be reintegrated with the whole. The meaning of any functional activity is understood only if its relation to the activities of the whole is known, which of course is an endless process. The more we know, the more questions there are. The more we know about function, physiology, biochemistry, etc., the genetics, the more it's complicated, and the more there is to learn, and the more they interact with each other in unpredictable ways. So, paragraph 42, aphorism 42, the unity of life takes place. Try to find, you know, if we're going to think, not just language, extrinsic wholeness versus, or holism versus intrinsic wholeness, you know, the mind can think of these things better if it has images. So these are an attempt to find an image that represents true wholeness. Here it's from a Native American drawing, the earth is within the person, as well as without. All right. The unity of the life principle, aphorism 45. Right. That the unity has to include the life principle, or we don't understand wholeness, and we don't understand unity, in its true sense, says Hahnemann. All right, so practical, just for a moment. So then that's why we see that the other systems of medicine don't truly cure, because they're not addressing the real wholeness. You know, if you limit your outcomes to something local, something short-term, something not in time, you know, out of context to life, then it looks like you're getting improvement. If you have a more strict definition of cure, none of these things are cures. All right. That's it. Any comments? No. Well, it interests me, so I think that when if homeopathy is going to make a resurgence, that these are the things that will make it important. Not just finding a remedy that cures a particular situation in a given circumstance. If the bigger picture isn't understood, then homeopathy again will go through a phase where it's kind of absorbed in the mainstream and mainstream way of thinking, and then the true power will be lost again, and it'll be eclipsed again until people really grasp the bigger principles that Hahnemann outlines in the organism, not just the practical part. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Shepherd?
Yes.
Any of the,
Yes.
the great, like, old Greek physicians or Razzies, like any of the old, like, well-known experts of their time, did they talk about holism?
So early on in homeopathy, as now, right, as everyone here is, they're interested in finding the remedy that cures the person's diagnosis, the disease. Right? And that has been the emphasis in all the homeopathic literature. There are authors who took the time to look into it further, but they're, few and far between. All the famous homeopaths were the ones that got practical results, were able to find the right remedy for the most serious of complicated of problems. So that's a general answer, but you can look in the literature and find it here and there. But you have to be careful. Even Kent, for instance, who's got a whole book, lectures on philosophy, has his own take on it based on his religious beliefs.
Dr. Shepherd?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Amishi.
Yes. I don't know where to look. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I have a question as well. I have a few thoughts. I understand the theory of holism from homeopathic viewpoint because of familiarity with organon, and I completely understand it. But to people who do not have or who have not read the organon, to explain or trying to explain to them, even the smartest of MDs and smartest of healthcare providers, it is so difficult for them or for us to try to understand, make them understand the viewpoint of holism, because they just can't get it. So my comment is, do you think that branches like functional medicine or similar upcoming theories are an attempt to try to make non-homeopaths understand the concept of holism? Because everybody wants something tangible to understand the concept of holism. This is my thought and my comment. I'm not sure if I'm correct or or am I thinking or trying to understand the viewpoint. that everybody's trying to make others understand in the medical faculty the concept of holism by giving these diagrams that can be seen and some visual impression that can be understood.
Yes. So I would say that whether we know it or not, all of us have these images, assumptions, worldviews already in our mind. And however we think of it, whether we know it or not, it determines how we practice. So then there are those who are trying to, they're seeing a new way of practice works, and so then they step back and try to explain why their new way of practice, functional medicine, is necessary and needed. So then they develop a worldview. And they are, people realize the deficiencies and inadequacies of the reductionist mainstream medicine. And so the functional medicine doctor should be applauded for that ability to see beyond what they learned in medical school. But there's, to a homeopath, there's more. And so we shouldn't lose sight of it. The newest thing that's attracting everybody, is still not original homeopathy, and that was the point of bringing this out, not to criticize functional medicine. They're doing a good job, a necessary job.
Yes. And I have one question. So in the book Divided Legacy, the author compares and contrasts reductionistic philosophy versus holistic philosophy. And in the reductionistic or the mechanical philosophy, he says that how originally, before pharmacology came into being, the early people who studied medicine viewed human body as a machine. They thought of arteries and veins and those vessels as actually pipes and conduits, just like you would have, in a mechanical system. And then came the beta blockers, and they were like, okay, if we raise the pressure in the heart, or if we raise the pressure in the arterioles, this will happen. If we reduce the pressure, then we can control the hypertension. So based on that theory, they defend something like beta blockers, and it works. So how can we argue that that reductionistic theory doesn't work, or it is not a foolproof or a good theory? Because they would say that we give medicines and it works. So what's wrong in that? I mean, I know as a homeopath that the basic philosophy is wrong, but if they can understand the homeopathic philosophy of holism, they would say like, okay, we are giving medicines and it works. So why do you say it's not a good medicine?
Well, it works depending what you're willing to observe. The example I gave in class about venous section, bleeding people, that was the accepted practice for not decades but centuries, because it works. If someone is congested, high fever, infectious, and headache, and hot, and you take away their blood, they immediately feel better. Right? So in modern perspective, it's because you can't mount an inflammatory response if you take away the blood. The inflammatory properties got to the area where the sickness is through the blood. If you take the blood away, then they're relieved of the inflammatory process. So that's the same thing with modern medicine. I mean, aspirin, ibuprofens, they work quick, immediate. It worked, but only if you look at the moment. Only if you look at one or two or three or certain limited endpoints, and not a truly holism or holistic perspective. And people don't look for it because it agrees with their worldview.
I think.
Thank you.
Without debating all the little nuances, as a physician or as looking at what healing is and holism is, you have to have, I guess it's a mission statement, or it's what Hahnemann said in his first aphorism, which is the cure. What you're trying to do is restore the health of the whole person quickly, effectively, whatever. So you know, when you ask yourself if any of the things you're doing, if any of the tests you're taking are looking for and are considering the whole person and their well-being over time, if you evaluate any form of therapeutics in that context, you'd have to see the failure of the smaller interventions on therapeutic levels that have seemingly good outcomes without evaluating it in the context of time and in the context of the health of the whole being. If you look at mental, emotional, physical whole being as parts of the whole person, it takes it out of those contexts. It's just totally removed. If you don't have an endpoint that's definable, that's applicable and applicable across the board to all forms of therapeutic interventions, of all forms of seeming changes that you're doing, then you know the functional medicine is still falling short. It's still falling short.
So that's said by someone who practices homeopathy.
Yeah.
But if you're not, you don't see it. You don't understand it, because you as a practicing allopath, a regular doctor, you see results all the time. You save lives all the time. You know, if you're an emergency room doctor, you do things that look like they're helping. So there's nothing wrong with that under certain circumstances. But as homeopaths, you know, we have to get out there and tell them that it's not the whole picture. Shouldn't be satisfied. And just a historical note, you know, Harris Coulter wrote 4 volumes called The Divided Legacy. He was alive when I was a young homeopath, and I got to know him. So he used the words empiricism and rationalism to make the distinction here. That we're using slightly different words. And what he says is that depending on the century you're talking about, whatever was the newest, most advanced machine of the time was how they looked at the human body. So the old mechanisms, and then hydraulics came into it, and the steam engine, and then you had pressures and gases, you know, and then you had more modern view of the body. In our times, you know, everything, the most modern machines are like the computers. Right? So you hear this representative explanation of what happens in our brain based on the image, the analogy to the machines that humans have made, the most complex or the newest type of machines that humans have made. Okay? So what kind of machine is holistic? Nothing but life. True life. It is the most holistic machine. So, you know, you have to have that perspective. You know, that's what Harris Coulter tried to point out.
Yes, Dr. Shepard, actually. I did change the words because I read the first volume a long time ago and I couldn't remember the words, but that's why I just put in the reductionistic theory. But I'm glad that you brought up the right words.
Right.
But I just wanted to, you know, to share that.
Yes, that's right. So here we have people that have been practicing homeopathy. They already know this. I'm just trying to put it into words for those who haven't, you know, had the chance to think about it further.
You mentioned extrinsic, which and intrinsic holism. Could you just review that one more time? It sounds like you're saying the functional medicine is more extrinsic holism.
That's right.
And homeopathy talks more about intrinsic holism.
That's right. So the extrinsic means you're still taking parts and adding them together in an engineering way, right? An engineer has to look at the whole function of a bridge, let's say, to build a bridge. They have to look at everything, both the wind shear and, you know, everything from the outside and the inside, but it's still the parts that they have to put together to work as a whole. So you got an engineer that's specialist in the material, an engineer that's specialist in tensile strength, an engineer who's specialist on, you know, on knowing what the wind is going to do to the structure. So you have all these different parts to come together to make the whole. That's the functional medicine. Their parts are organ system functions. Intrinsic wholeness, then, is only for, you know, life forms. We're whole from the very beginning. Therefore, the disease is always whole. And if you try to understand disease by only looking at some of the parts instead of the wholeness, then you're never going to get complete cure. That's intrinsic wholeness, inherent, irreducible, meaningful, only at the level of wholeness.
Does Hahnemann say what it is that makes us a collection of parts? There's a wholeness. I mean,
Well, the first three.
God, there's all the other stuff.
Well, he believed in God, but he's a practical person. He says, you know, you can believe whatever you want about the Creator. You know, we're practitioners. We've got a method that cures people now. We'll never understand why, you know, creation is made this way, perhaps. Then, you know, but we have something that's reproducible, valid, consistent. Use it, even if we don't understand all the chemistry and physiology, if you're a materialist, or if you don't understand why God made it this way. Okay, so that is one part of it. The second part is he didn't use the term vital force or any of its synonyms in the first three editions of the Organon. He's just the phenomena. This is what you observe. Dead things do this, live things do this, plus something else. Call it what you want. And it was only when all his colleagues kept saying, well, what is it? What is it that makes life work slightly differently than non-life? And so then he introduced a term that was popular in his culture, in his science, in his country at that time. So lots of scientists, they didn't call themselves scientists, and natural philosophers, were researching the vital force. So he just used that term to differentiate biosis from abiosis, from life from non-life. He didn't accept the assumption that life comes from non-life. So that will be the next lecture, the assumptions of homeopathy versus the assumptions of mainstream thinking. There are assumptions in homeopathy. So we should get those out front. Exactly what is the worldview of homeopathy besides wholeness? Wholeness is one of them. This intrinsic wholeness. But there are, for simplicity, three others. So we'll talk about three other assumptions, and we'll compare and contrast that with mainstream scientific thinking. And to oversimplified, we'll just talk about 4 words for each of them. Right? So there are assumptions. There is a worldview of homeopathy. So, okay, so we can criticize that. We make assumptions too. But back to practice. Is what we do making people more healthy than other techniques? Does it truly cure? Can it cure things that other therapeutic modalities can't do? And so then we're back to practical results. And those of us who practice, of course, say yes. So you can have all these ideas, all these theories, all these assumptions, all these worldviews. We're back to listening to how to find the practical thing that really helps people right now. Okay, so we stepped out of that for a while, but every day in our practice we go back into it. Anything else? Okay, that's it.
Learning the mechanism behind homeopathy is going to change Holism
So that concludes today's meeting. It will be followed immediately by our annual business meeting. But just remember, a reminder that it's Saturday, November 18th is going to be our next meeting. So Saturday the 18th.
Bob?
Oh, hi, Vichy.
Hi, Bob.
Hello.
Hi. So are we having the business meeting in the room, or is it going to be in the restaurant?
Yep. No, it's just going to be right here.
Okay.
Yep.
So who is taking down the minutes then?
Who's taking down the minutes? I don't know.
You should.
Yes, Dr. Fear.
Yeah, so I mean, you can do it or I can do it. I mean, I think
Can
those
you
are the
please do it this time because I might be gone for some time, but I will be try to be there for most of the time.
Okay, I'll do it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
No, I didn't find it. I didn't find it yet. It just gave me recent ones, but I didn't find it. I'm going to go through the package and tell it's easy for me.
So I can turn this off, right?
Yeah, turn off.
Dr. Fear?
Yeah.
Is Dr. Shepard available for a quick chat?
Yeah, he's right here.
Yes. So
Why don't we, maybe we'll, and let me, Elizabeth, are you there too?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
So why don't we let's take a 5-minute break,
Okay, 5-minute break.
and then you can talk to Joel.
okay.
Okay, I'm here. Go ahead. Hello?
Dr. Shepard, so
Yeah.
my concern is that as much as we know that what is holism, and today you mentioned that even going down to the gene theory is a reductionistic theory, but if we look around, there are so many employments based on, or people are employed in these industries, and their livelihood depends upon not actually understanding or refuting the very theory that we believe in. So how can we expect that it's going to change? I mean, because that gives me actually, I feel that it's never going to change, and homeopathy will never be accepted because of the very fact that there are so many, like the bioengineering industry and the pharmacological industry. I get discouraged when I think in that fashion.
So it may not happen in those countries where it's so, status quo, it's so static that we can't break these. It'll happen in countries where they're less developed, perhaps. But second is it'll be of necessity. That is, the tools in regular medicine will work less and less, like antibiotic resistance already. And so it's like the energy industry. What's happening to all the coal miners? What's happening, to all the old energy ways of producing? It's a hugely drastic and disruptive force. And look what it's done to politics of the country. The old and the new. It's not going to be easy. I agree.
Okay.
So I don't think it'll happen in the United States first. I don't think it'll happen it'll have to happen someplace where there's more openness and we're ready to develop things from scratch.
Okay. I'll be optimistic.
Okay, very good. That always helps. Okay, I'm going to take a couple-minute break.
Thank you, Dr. Shepard.
Okay.
We have our meeting, right? So I need a copy. Today's the 22nd. I'm sorry. Okay, I didn't send this to them.
But the document thing, it's kind of specialized.
I'm gonna take the minutes.
So last year's minutes are on here. So
Exactly. I mean, they have
you can just
see the one that's
update
as we
that way.
yeah. I don't tell you so.
10 too. Everybody's still on, right? 10. Another recording's still on.
Oh, yeah, let me stop the recording.
Turn it off.
Hi, Dr. Shepard. And congratulations on your award.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I didn't know about it last week, so I was here for the time.
We're going to be here too, right?
Yeah. Retirement treaty.